John Watkins, the former chargé d'affaires and ambassador to the Soviet Union, died while in RCMP custody during the purges. Welcome back to Here, Queer, and Maple Syrup, a look at queer Canadian history, an extension of my TikTok series. I'm Jacob, your host. Thank you for continuing to join me on this journey as we dive into a part of Canadian history that is largely ignored. I'd like to recognize that this podcast is recorded in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people. I would also like to acknowledge that the queer community is diverse and intersectional. With that in mind, let's explore the gay purges in Canada together. John Watkins was one of the most important Canadian diplomats of the 20th century. He was directly involved in the development of Canada's diplomatic relationship with the Soviet Union in the 1950s. Watkins first joined the Department of External Affairs, now known as Global Affairs Canada, in 1946, at the very beginning of the Cold War. Less than 10 years later, he was the Canadian ambassador to the Soviet Union since he spoke some Russian. He served in this position from 1954 until 1956. During his time in Soviet Russia, he was very well respected by both Canadians and Russians. And it was because prior to his appointment as ambassador, he was the chargé d'affaires, who is essentially the second in command to the ambassador, a position he began in 1948 and left in 1951 due to his appointment to the Canadian Embassy in Norway between 1952 and 1954. Watkins was so well respected by both countries that he was able to arrange a meeting between then Minister of External Affairs Lester B. Pearson, who would later go on to be Prime Minister in the early 1960s, and then leader of Soviet Russia, Nikita Khrushchev, in 1955. Following his tenure as ambassador, he returned to Canada to be the Assistant Undersecretary of External Affairs until 1958, and then a final ambassadorial position in Denmark from 1958 until 1960. He retired in 1963 for health reasons and moved to Paris. While serving as Canadian ambassador to the Soviet Union, Watkins had two brief romantic affairs. The first was with an Uzbek poet named Akundi, though his name only appears in one report, so that may not be his name. The other was a younger man named Kamal. These are important because they were the main reason behind the events that followed, as well as Watkins' legacy. In 1964, Watkins had been retired for a year and was living in Paris. Initially, the government tried to offer Watkins a job so he could be available for interrogation, but he declined. The RCMP then showed up in Paris and brought him back to Canada, Montreal specifically, to follow up on reports they had heard about his time as ambassador to the Soviet Union. It was part of an RCMP operation called Operation Rock Bottom. Watkins ended up being interrogated in 3 cities in 3 countries. They started in Paris, France, then they moved to London, UK, but the final and most significant portion of the interrogation took place in a hotel in Montreal. The KGB had apparently found out about one of his major affairs as well as a few other flings. But the poet was not a plant. Kamal was. He was bait by the KGB because they figured out that Watkins was gay. During his interrogation, Watkins admitted to a number of romantic and sexual affairs. However, the only one that seems to have been a KGB plant was Kamal. He also admitted that he had become friends with some Russians based on mutual cultural interests. Unfortunately, some of those friends did include some high-ranking members of the KGB. In one of the interrogation reports, it is indicated that just before he left Moscow, one of Watkins' friends, named Gorbanov, alluded to Kamal's homosexuality, leaving Watkins in a feeling of unease. He seems to have realized at this moment that Kamal was a KGB plant. Watkins met with this friend a few days later and was presented with a dossier of his entire affair with Kamal, including photographs. But he didn't deny any of it. His friend tore it up and asked him to help the Soviet ambassador to Canada, which Watkins refused to do. When speaking to RCMP investigators, Watkins replied at a few different moments during his nearly month-long interrogation that, quote, "You can question my judgment, but you cannot question my loyalty," end quote. And I feel like it's important to point out that it is unlikely that Kamal himself was KGB in the sense that, or rather in the same sense that the KGB members who blackmailed or attempted to blackmail Watkins were. Kamal was more likely a Russian citizen who worked for the government, whose sexual orientation was discovered by the KGB, and then they blackmailed him to have a romantic and sexual affair with John Watkins. According to Watkins, Gorbanov reached out a few other times in an attempt to turn Watkins, including during his tenure as ambassador to Denmark, but he consistently refused. Despite Watkins' own words, the RCMP officers interrogating him still didn't believe that he hadn't been compromised by the Soviets or the KGB. They had made that determination before they even brought him in. His interrogation was merely a rubber stamp on their already completed report. And they admit to this in correspondence 2 days before Watkins' death, where they state that they are not getting what they believe to be the true story, and they decide to up the ante in order to get what they believe is the true version of events. They even say that if Watkins, whom they name as rock bottom in all correspondence, suggests that he needs to go back to Paris, they need to make it clear that he needs to stay by any means necessary until they are satisfied. He was likely never going to return to his home in Paris. They would have found a way to keep him, even if he didn't die. The interrogation lasted 27 days. On the 12th of October 1964, Watkins died of a heart attack. The RCMP then covered it up for 16 years. When the coroner arrived, an officer named Brandes posed as one of Watkins' friends and claimed he just dropped dead. I've been researching Watkins for a few years now, and there is something that I need to add. There are 3 versions of the cover-up death story that I found. The first was that he had a heart attack at the airport, waiting for a flight to meet up with some friends for his birthday. The second was that he was at a buffet with his friends when he dropped dead of a heart attack. The third, which I discovered while researching this episode, was that he died getting ready to go out with his friends to celebrate his birthday. The third, from a logical perspective, seems like the likeliest scenario because Brandes, one of the officers interrogating Watkins, and who did not mention that he was an RCMP officer, told the coroner they were friends when the coroner went up to the hotel room. There was no mention of Leslie Bennett, a Welshman working on the case with Brandes, at all. He was completely excluded from the coroner's report. In 1980, investigative reporter Ian Adams uncovered the truth. Watkins died in RCMP custody. When he blew the whistle, the government and the RCMP were forced to admit to a nearly 2 decades-long cover-up of the death of a very important ambassador. After he exposed the cover-up, it took until the following year for an inquiry to be called. But here's the catch. We still don't know the exact circumstances of his death. Even after the cover-up was exposed, they worked so hard to cover it up that no one really knows what happened. While researching my master's thesis, I found 3 versions. The first was that he just generally died while in RCMP custody. The second was that he had just finished his interrogation for the day and he was reminiscing with the officers present about his time in the Soviet Union as ambassador and as chargé d'affaires. The third was that he died in the middle of an interrogation. They are still covering up his death. In the documents we have about Watkins through the Purge Fund via the 1994 amendments to the Access to Information Act, there is significant redaction, including a particular document which has a long block of redaction and is preceded by the text, quote, "At 12:25 a.m. on October 13th, 1964, Sergeant Locke of the Ville Saint-Laurent Police Department phoned in this office and gave the following information concerning the sudden death of a Canadian ambassador," end quote. Another reason that particular quote is odd is that, according to other reports, the RCMP commissioner was informed at 10:30 p.m. that Watkins had a massive heart attack around 10:05 Eastern Standard Time. Apparently, an ambulance was called at 10:07 p.m. and it arrived at 10:12 p.m. According to an otherwise very vague piece of correspondence, there is an oddly specific event that occurred at 10:30 a.m. the next morning. Apparently, Officer Bennett went to see the police and was particularly interested in finding out when Watkins' next of kin was notified, how they reacted, and who they intended on telling. And quite frankly, I feel like that specific event says a lot and is very just telling about the entirety of Operation Rock Bottom. Once the truer circumstances of his death became public knowledge, there was an inquiry ordered in September of 1981. The result shocked everyone. Coroner Stanislas Derry was appointed to render a decision on whether or not the RCMP was responsible in any way for Watkins' death 17 years earlier. Over the course of the inquiry, 21 people stood as witnesses, many of whom were police officers who gave contradictory information and evidence, including Brandes, who claimed that one of his superiors, Commander Kelly, attended the scene the day after Watkins' death. Kelly denied that. Watkins' doctor, who he saw days before his death, testified, despite Brandes and other officers stating that Watkins had not seen a doctor in the days before his death. Derry ended up exonerating the RCMP completely and stated he would only direct recommendations to the coroner's office because there seems to have been no actual examination of his body. That investigative reporter, Ian Adams, would go on to write the novel Agent of Influence, which centers around Watkins' interrogation. It was adapted into a TV movie starring Christopher Plummer in 2002. While researching my master's thesis, I watched it, and the film almost entirely erases Watkins' sexual orientation. There is a line in the first 5 minutes where the CIA says something about trying to find faggot spies, and then no more mention of queerness, positively or negatively, until over an hour into the movie. When they brought in Watkins, they made it sound like the CIA in the US was upset about nuclear proliferation, which was when Canada pushed to get rid of nuclear warheads on the world stage, which really pissed off the Americans. I'm just going to quickly add that we still have that today. Canada does not have nuclear weapons because of that whole thing. We have nuclear capable submarines, but we don't actually have nuclear warheads. And it was because of that whole thing that happened. I remember complaining about the movie to a friend of mine who I was doing my master's with, and he said, not everything has to be about someone's sexual orientation, which I feel like in any other situation is 100% true, except for this. My friend is gay, and I totally get why he said that. I told him that Watkins was brought in specifically because he was gay, to which my friend responded basically with, well, okay, yeah, that should be about him being gay. There were a couple of short flashback scenes during the final 30-ish minutes to his Paris apartment where he is with a young man who is presumably his partner. But it's still not explicitly stated. The two of them are just kind of like sat at the piano, and then they get up and they go over and stand by a window. And I'm pretty sure that that's supposed to be Kamal, who, I mean, it's possible that they actually pursued a relationship in Paris, like for the last year or so of Watkins' life. It's entirely possible. But there really is no proof of that. There's no concrete evidence that points to Kamal living with Watkins in Paris, or that Watkins even had a partner. In the film, Watkins comes out as gay to the female RCMP officer in a tender, lovely scene. In any other context, this would be a really touching scene, considering when the film was made and when it takes place. The glaring issue, and part of the reason why I have to specify her gender at all, is the fact that in 1964, women were not allowed to join the RCMP. The character is a composite of a bunch of male RCMP officers who would have actually been a part of his interrogation. And while I normally wouldn't think too much about that particular detail in any other setting, when the character of Watkins avoids talking about his queerness for most of the movie and then just blurts it out when the two of them are alone, it gives the incorrect perception that Watkins was ashamed of his sexual orientation. In reality, reading the interrogation reports, Watkins was not ashamed of his sexual orientation. He openly spoke, sometimes in surprising detail for the time period, of sexual acts he was involved with. The other big issue with Agent of Influence that doesn't really have to do with Watkins' queerness and everything to do with the Canadian identity of the reality of what happened, the CIA didn't actually have much to do with his interrogation. The blatant homophobia was all Bennett, Brandes, and the others involved. The other issue is and this will be the final issue that I talk about in relation to agent of influence, but it's the fact that they actually brought out the fruit machine, which I talked about in the previous episode. But you see, there is zero proof that John Watkins was ever subjected to the fruit machine, like anywhere. It's kind of possible, I guess, because it was in use at that time, but I really don't think that they did. They would have used lie detector and they would have used other means of interrogation, but specifically the fruit machine, it was mainly based in Ottawa at that point. There weren't really, I mean, as I talked about in the last episode, it was only in 1969, just before partial decriminalization, when Dr. Wake broached the subject of making mobile units. And so it is kind of possible, but not really, that Watkins would have been subjected to that. In the years following his death, Watkins wasn't forgotten by the Department of External Affairs. He was still frequently talked about and referred to. In a memo from 1969 marked top secret, there are notes that say that he was, quote, a homosexual who was active homosexually during his tours in Moscow, end quote. That's such a weird phrase, both to say aloud and to write. Another report on Watkins said that he had no weakness, but handwritten text next to that read, quote, except homosexuality, like just kind of like scrawled on the side, like as an addition to that sentence. Yeah, it's odd. But that's what they did. Also, there's an entire document from 1981 that talks about the discrepancies, but chalks them up to memory fading after 17 years. Though Brandes admits that they didn't take notes or much of a report, he himself admits to being surprised at the informality of it all. It really begs the question, why so informal? John Watkins was one of the most influential Canadian ambassadors of the 1950s, and likely in Cold War diplomacy. Yet there was no autopsy or proper examination. They covered his death up for 17 years, and they took no real reports or notes about the matter at the time? The homophobia in those particular government circles still ran very deep at that time. Like, so deep. John Watkins deserved so much better. His death should have never been covered up. Honestly, the fact that they covered up his death in the first place tells me that they had something to hide from the beginning. You don't create a massive cover-up like that unless you know that you were in the wrong, especially someone as prominent as John Watkins, or any ambassador who brokered a meeting between the Canadian Minister of External Affairs and the leader of the Soviet Union. That would have made massive headlines. People would have known generally who he was. He might not have been a household name, but he would have been like, if people saw his name in the newspaper, they would have been like, oh, yeah, that's who that is. And after everything, they never found any evidence that Watkins had ever given any confidential information or any information he just shouldn't have given to the Russians at any point in time. And they only ever did an investigation of sorts after two defectors claimed that someone working in the Canadian embassy in the Soviet Union at the time was blackmailed. From the 20th to the 22nd of August, so literally when this episode is being released, I'm going to be in Ottawa exploring major queer historic sites from the purges and the AIDS crisis. The next time we talk about queer Canadian history, I'll be talking about the experiences from being there in person at some of those really important queer historic sites. Until next time.